The reason George S. Patton was always given the hardest missions has nothing to do with ego, bravado, or personal ambition, and everything to do with how Allied command reacted when plans stopped working. From 1943 onward, Patton was not treated like a standard field commander. He was treated like an emergency measure, the man brought forward when timetables slipped, momentum vanished, and hesitation started to look more dangerous than risk. June 1943 sits at the center of that shift. North Africa is officially won, but the mood inside Allied headquarters is strained rather than triumphant. American forces have learned how to fight, but they have not yet shown they can move fast under pressure or recover when operations drift off schedule. British commanders remain cautious, political leaders remain nervous, and nobody believes the next phase of the war will allow room for hesitation. That problem has nothing to do with maps or troop numbers. It has everything to do with confidence. The invasion of Sicily looms ahead, and failure there would not just cost lives. It would undermine Allied credibility at the exact moment momentum needs to be protected. A slow campaign would give the Germans time to adapt, reorganize, and recover from losses in North Africa. Speed matters now in a way it did not before. That is where Patton enters the equation, not as a hero, but as insurance. Allied planners already understand something about him that sets him apart. When friction appears, Patton does not stop to fix it. He moves through it. Broken communications, unclear orders, imperfect coordination, none of it stops him for long. Where other commanders demand clarity before advancing, Patton advances and lets clarity catch up later. That behavior makes staff officers uncomfortable, which meant they noticed it immediately. Coalition warfare depends on predictability, coordination, and consensus, and Patton violates all three. He does not wait for agreement, he creates pressure. He does not move cautiously, he overwhelms. That approach disqualifies him from many roles, but it also makes him indispensable when the alternative is paralysis. By mid-1943, a quiet pattern forms inside Allied planning circles. When an operation starts to drift off schedule, when progress slows and political anxiety rises, Patton's name appears. Not because success is guaranteed, but because stagnation is unacceptable. Sicily becomes the first clear example. On paper, Patton's 7th Army is assigned a supporting role. British forces under Montgomery are expected to lead the advance, while American units protect flanks and reinforce pressure. That balance collapses almost immediately. Terrain slows movement, coordination breaks down, and rival command styles pull the operation in different directions. Progress becomes uneven, and the political cost of delay grows with every passing day. Patton does not wait for the plan to catch up with reality. He interprets his mission aggressively, pushes west, then north, then east, capturing Palermo and driving toward Messina at a pace that unsettles Allied headquarters. The reaction follows a familiar sequence. Anger comes first, followed by alarm, and then something closer to relief once the momentum becomes impossible to ignore. What nobody expected was how quickly Patton's advance would turn an awkward campaign into a race. This moment defines his wartime role more clearly than any speech or declaration ever could. Patton is not being rewarded for creativity. He is being tolerated because he solved a problem the system could not admit it had. The invasion did not stall on paper, but everyone knew it was slowing in practice, and Patton forced the issue before delay turned into embarrassment. That pattern never disappears. From this point on, Patton becomes the commander associated with broken timetables. When plans drift, when momentum falters, when Allied leadership needs visible progress, He is the man sent forward. These assignments are not prestigious. They are dangerous. They carry political weight far beyond their military objectives. Sicily must move quickly to justify the cost of the invasion. France must break open after Normandy to prove the landings were worth the risk. Late-war Germany must collapse fast enough to preserve Allied unity under growing strain. Patton is not chosen because these missions are safe. He is chosen because delay is no longer an option. That distinction explains almost everything about his career. Another truth sits beneath it, one rarely stated outright. Patton is politically expendable in a way other senior commanders are not. His reputation is volatile by default. His language, discipline, and temperament make him controversial without effort. Allied leadership understands that if an operation goes wrong under Patton, blame can be contained. If he succeeds, victory belongs to the Allies. If he fails, failure belongs to Patton. That arrangement makes him ideal for high-risk assignments where leadership wants upside without shared liability. It also explains why he is given freedom others never receive, while never being trusted with long-term authority. Patton understands this bargain, even if he never spells it out publicly. His private writings reveal a man who knows he is being used as much as he is being trusted. He accepts the role because it aligns with how he understands war. To Patton, war is not a careful process. It is a contest of will, and pressure applied quickly matters more than perfection applied slowly. By the time Allied forces prepare for the invasion of France, Patton's function is fully defined. He is held back, not because he is unimportant, but because his presence is too valuable to waste early. When the moment arrives, he is expected to move fast enough to erase doubt. Normandy succeeds in spectacle, but stumbles in execution. The landings work, but the aftermath turns into a grind. Terrain chokes movement, casualties rise, and German resistance proves more resilient than expected. Public optimism masks private concern inside headquarters. What Allied planners need is not another careful commander. They need momentum restored before doubt spreads. That changed when Patton's Third Army is finally activated and unleashed with instructions so broad they border on deliberate vagueness. He is told to exploit success wherever it appears, which meant pushing until friction reappears, and pushing through that as well. From the first days of that advance, Patton does exactly what he has been brought in to do. He moves faster than the system can comfortably support, stretching supply lines and forcing decisions up the chain of command rather than waiting for them. Once again, the hardest mission finds him not because he asked for it, but because something had already gone wrong. This is the pattern that will define the rest of his war. When Allied confidence wavers, Patton moves. When timetables collapse, Patton advances. When hesitation threatens to turn into failure, Patton becomes the answer. And that is why the hardest missions always seem to find him first. By the summer of 1944, Allied command has reached an uncomfortable realization that never appears in public briefings. Planning alone is not winning this war. Coordination helps, resources matter, but none of it guarantees movement once an operation bogs down. When momentum disappears, it does not return on its own. Someone has to force it back into existence. That realization reshapes how George S. Patton is used. The Normandy landings succeed in scale and shock, but the campaign that follows exposes a dangerous weakness. Allied armies can cross the Channel, but once ashore, they struggle to move. The Bocage country turns every mile into a fight. German units adapt quickly to defensive warfare, and progress slows to a crawl that no timetable had predicted. This is not collapse yet, but the direction is unmistakable. Inside headquarters, Concern grows with each stalled advance. A prolonged battle in Normandy threatens more than casualties. It risks public confidence, political patience, and the fragile belief that the Allies control the pace of the war. Every day spent grinding forward strengthens German morale and weakens Allied credibility. That pressure changes how decisions are made. When the breakout finally comes, Patton's Third Army is activated with a sense of urgency that borders on relief. The orders he receives are deliberately broad. He is instructed to exploit success wherever it appears, which means the responsibility for deciding where and how to move is pushed downward onto him. That is not trust in the usual sense. It is necessity. What follows unsettles nearly everyone watching from behind the lines. Patton's columns surge forward faster than supply officers consider comfortable. Fuel becomes more valuable than ammunition, and maps change faster than staff officers can revise them. Units move before coordination feels complete, and decisions are made on the road rather than at conference tables. The result is exactly what Allied command needed and exactly what it feared. German forces are not destroyed neatly. They are disoriented, outpaced, and forced into retreat before they can stabilize their defenses. Confusion spreads faster than Allied armor, and German commanders find themselves reacting instead of planning. Patton's advance creates dilemmas the enemy cannot solve in time. This is why he was chosen. Other generals could have advanced carefully and methodically. Patton advances explosively. He does not wait for certainty. He creates facts on the ground that force everyone else, friend and enemy alike, to adjust. What nobody says openly is that Patton is not being used to execute the plan. He is being used to rescue it. The plan did not fail on paper, but reality has drifted far enough from expectation to make denial dangerous. Patton's role is to fix the problem without requiring anyone to admit it exists. His success allows headquarters to pretend momentum never disappeared in the first place. This arrangement carries political advantages as well. Aggressive operations bring risks that extend beyond the battlefield. Civilian casualties rise, supply lines stretch thin, and coordination with allies becomes strained. These outcomes invite scrutiny, criticism, and blame. Assigning such operations to Patton concentrates those risks around a single figure whose reputation is already controversial. If success follows, the Allies claim it collectively. If controversy follows, Patton absorbs it personally. That is not cruelty. It is wartime management. Patton becomes a lightning rod, drawing attention away from systemic problems and toward individual behavior. His language, temperament, and style provide convenient explanations whenever discomfort arises. This allows the larger structure to remain intact, even when it depends heavily on his recklessness. Yet this freedom is never unconditional. Patton is allowed to act boldly because leadership believes it can rein him in at any moment. His authority extends across the battlefield, but stops short of strategic direction. He is trusted with breakthroughs, not outcomes, movement, not settlement, action, not consequence. That distinction explains why Patton is never placed in charge of occupation planning. As Allied forces race across France, his Third Army is continually pushed forward. Every mile gained reinforces the belief that speed solves problems. Every success raises expectations. But with each advance, unease grows inside headquarters that Patton's momentum may outrun political reality. That concern sharpens dramatically in December 1944. The German offensive in the Ardennes ruptures Allied lines with shocking speed. Units are surrounded, communications break down, and confidence falters across the front. This is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of anticipation, and the consequences are immediate. Once again, Allied leadership needs action faster than planning can provide. Patton's response becomes legendary, but the conditions that made it possible matter just as much as the maneuver itself. His ability to pivot his army north in winter conditions works because his entire command structure is built for uncertainty. Orders arrive incomplete, and his subordinates expect that. Routes change, and his units adapt. Friction does not paralyze them because friction has been normal for months. This is the culmination of why Patton keeps receiving the hardest missions. He has been shaped by crisis to function where systems break down. The relief of Bastogne restores Allied confidence almost overnight. Public narratives stabilize, panic subsides, and the front holds. Patton has done exactly what he was expected to do, even though no one spelled it out clearly. But success brings a new problem. If Patton can move this fast, how much control does headquarters actually have over him? The traits that made him indispensable during disaster now look dangerous as victory approaches. His independence, once tolerated, begins to worry senior leaders. His blunt worldview, once dismissed as theater, now threatens political consequences. The closer the Allies move toward Germany, the more fragile unity becomes. Patton is not a unifier. He is a breaker, and that quality has always been his value. The problem is that breaking things becomes riskier once the war's outcome feels assured. Leadership begins to reassess the arrangement they created, even while continuing to depend on it. By the end of 1944, that tension defines Patton's position. He is still needed to push, still expected to move faster than others, but increasingly watched, constrained, and managed. The hardest missions continue to find him, but they no longer come with trust. They come with fear. And that fear will shape how the final phase of his war unfolds. By early 1945, the war has crossed a line that few people inside Allied headquarters openly acknowledge. Defeat is no longer the danger. Disorder is. The enemy is collapsing. Fronts are stabilizing. And attention is shifting away from survival toward control. For the first time since North Africa, the problem is not how to break through, but how to manage what comes next. This change does not favor George S. Patton. For most of the war, Patton's value came from his comfort with uncertainty. He operated best when information was incomplete, when orders arrived late, and when hesitation threatened to undo weeks of planning. Chaos did not slow him down. It sharpened him. That instinct had been tolerated, even protected, because the war demanded it. The war no longer does. As Allied armies push deeper into Germany, movement remains important, but it is no longer everything. Each town captured now carries political weight. Each decision about prisoners, civilians, and infrastructure feeds into the shape of the post-war world. Speed still matters, but restraint matters more than it ever has before. Patton does not adjust easily to this shift. His Third Army continues to advance aggressively, often faster than planners prefer. From a purely military standpoint, the logic remains sound. Enemy formations are still retreating, cohesion is still fragile, and pressure still produces results. The difference is that pressure now creates political consequences alongside military ones. That is where the friction begins. Allied leadership grows increasingly careful about who controls which territory and how it is administered once captured. Occupation zones are already being discussed, influence is being measured in miles, and the next conflict is quietly taking shape before the current one has even ended. This environment rewards caution, diplomacy, and silence. Patton offers none of these things. The same blunt worldview that drove his success now alarms his superiors. He speaks openly, thinks hierarchically, and treats victory as something that must be enforced, not managed. During the crisis years, those instincts were useful. As victory approaches, they become liabilities. This explains a shift that becomes obvious only in hindsight. Patton is still trusted to break through enemy lines, but he is no longer trusted to shape what follows. He is given objectives, not influence. He is directed toward movement, not governance. Authority over people, politics, and post-war order is deliberately kept out of his reach. That changed nothing about how hard his missions were. If anything, they become harder in a different way. Patton is now expected to move fast while thinking less freely. He must advance without destabilizing alliances, defeat enemies without creating headlines, and apply force without appearing uncontrolled. The margin for error shrinks even as expectations remain high. That contradiction grinds on him. Patton senses correctly that the system is tightening around him. Orders become more specific. Oversight increases. Political officers hover closer. The freedom he once enjoyed, born out of desperation, fades quietly. He is still being used, but no longer indulged. For a man whose identity is tied to action, this feels like suffocation. The psychological toll of being the fix-it general begins to surface more clearly during these months. Patton has spent years living under constant pressure. He has been summoned only when things go wrong, expected to move faster than logistics allow, and judged more harshly than his peers for mistakes others are permitted to make. Success has never brought rest. It has only raised expectations. Failure, on the other hand, has always threatened finality. One misstep too many, one comment out of place, one action that crosses an invisible line, and his usefulness could evaporate overnight. That awareness creates a mindset obsessed with relevance through motion. Slowing down feels dangerous. Inside Allied command, a quiet calculation begins to take shape. Patton is still effective, but his effectiveness now carries risks that extend beyond the battlefield. His independence worries planners who are thinking about post-war unity. His personality threatens narratives of discipline and control. The question is no longer whether he can deliver results. The question is how long he can be tolerated. No one confronts him directly. That would create exactly the kind of instability leadership is trying to avoid. Instead, Patton is managed. He is praised publicly, constrained privately, and kept moving because motion keeps him useful and distracted. The hardest missions still find him, but they no longer lead anywhere. Breakthroughs no longer come with greater authority. Success does not expand his role. It simply justifies using him again under tighter supervision. The ceiling above him lowers quietly, without announcement. Patton understands this, even if he refuses to accept it. His frustration grows as the war enters its final months. He sees himself winning battles while others prepare to manage peace. He resents what he views as softness, forgetting that the definition of victory has shifted. The war he understands is ending, and he has no interest in the one replacing it. That gap between Patton and Allied leadership becomes impossible to close. By the time Germany collapses, Patton does not feel triumphant, he feels displaced. The conditions that gave his instincts value vanish almost overnight. What replaces them is a system that rewards restraint, discretion, and obedience to political objectives. These were never his strengths. His post-war marginalization is often framed as sudden or unfair, but it follows directly from the role he played during the war. Patton was not sidelined because he failed. He was sidelined because he succeeded in a way that no longer fit the moment. The same system that relied on him to rescue broken operations now needs stability more than speed. And stability is something Patton neither enjoys nor inspires. Looking back, the pattern is clear. Patton thrived when failure loomed large and plans collapsed under pressure. He was indispensable when hesitation threatened disaster. He absorbed chaos so others could restore order afterward. Once order returned, his purpose disappeared. This is why his career feels unresolved. He was never meant to preside over victory parades or peace negotiations. He was meant to operate at the edge of collapse, to move when clarity vanished, and to force outcomes when the system froze. That is why the hardest missions always found him. And that is why, when the war finally ended, it left him behind. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine and pushed deeper into Germany, the nature of Patton's assignments begins to change in ways that are easy to miss if you only look at maps. The objectives are still aggressive, the distances still long, and the pressure to move remains intense. But the meaning behind those missions is no longer the same. What Allied command now wants is not just speed. They want control over how victory looks. That difference puts George S. Patton in an increasingly narrow role. For most of the war, Patton had been trusted with one task above all others: breaking things open. He shattered defensive lines, disrupted enemy planning, and forced retreats before German commanders could regain balance. Once that was done, someone else arrived to clean up, consolidate, and manage the consequences. That division of labor had worked well when chaos dominated the battlefield. As Germany collapses, that division becomes a liability. Territory now matters less for how fast it can be taken and more for what it represents. Every city captured becomes a symbol. Every decision about civilians, infrastructure, and former enemy officials feeds into the political shape of post-war Europe. The war is still being fought with weapons, but it is already being measured in legitimacy. Patton's instincts do not align with that world. His focus remains fixed on defeating the enemy completely, not on managing appearances. He views occupation as an extension of warfare rather than a separate phase. Order in his mind comes from authority and discipline, not negotiation or sensitivity. During earlier crises, that outlook was tolerated because the alternative was failure. Now, it creates tension. Allied leadership understands that the next conflict may begin before the current one fully ends. Relationships between former allies are already straining, and the political balance of Europe is fragile. In this environment, the margin for missteps shrinks dramatically. A careless remark, a heavy-handed policy, or an uncontrolled action can ripple far beyond the battlefield. Patton is not careless, but he is blunt. That bluntness, once dismissed as personality, now carries strategic weight. His words travel faster than his tanks, and his reputation magnifies every statement. Allied command begins to see him not just as a military asset, but as a political risk that must be contained. This explains a shift that becomes unmistakable by late March 1945. Patton continues to receive demanding assignments, but his authority over what happens after those advances is increasingly limited. He is told where to go and how fast to get there, but not how to shape what follows. Decisions about occupation policy, civilian administration, and post-war structure are deliberately placed elsewhere. He is trusted with force, not with restraint. That distinction frustrates him deeply. From Patton's perspective, he is still doing exactly what has been asked of him for years. He is moving fast, keeping pressure on the enemy, and preventing any chance of recovery. The fact that these actions now generate anxiety rather than praise feels like betrayal. From Allied leadership's perspective, The calculation is colder. Patton is still useful, but only within strict boundaries. His ability to break resistance remains valuable, especially as pockets of German forces continue to fight. At the same time, his independence must be managed carefully. The war no longer needs a general who creates momentum at any cost. It needs one who knows when to stop. This is where quiet hopes emerge that Patton might simply exhaust himself. No one says this out loud, and no one conspires against him. The logic is bureaucratic rather than personal. Systems prefer problems that resolve themselves. A general who fades quietly is easier to handle than one who must be confronted directly. Patton does not fade. He continues to push his army hard, pressing forward whenever resistance appears weak. His Third Army captures ground quickly, sometimes faster than planners expect or prefer. Militarily, the results are difficult to criticize. Politically, they create headaches. Each success sharpens the contradiction at the heart of his role. The harder he works, the more visible the limits placed on him become. Breakthroughs no longer lead to expanded influence. They lead to tighter oversight. This weighs on him. Years of being the fix-it general have conditioned Patton to equate worth with urgency. He has spent the war responding to crises, not managing calm. Now that calm is spreading, he feels the ground shifting under his feet. The system that once depended on him now seems eager to move past him. That realization fuels resentment. Patton does not see himself as reckless or outdated. He sees himself as consistent. The war, in his view, has not changed in its essence. The enemy may be weaker, but the need for strength remains. What has changed is the tolerance for how that strength is displayed. Allied leadership sees it differently. From their perspective, Patton has become a reminder of a phase they would rather forget. His presence recalls moments when victory was uncertain, when planning failed, and when improvisation saved the day. As the narrative of controlled success takes shape, those memories become inconvenient. This is why Patton's relationship with command never truly recovers. There is no dramatic break, no open dismissal, no public humiliation. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of his role. He is kept busy, kept moving, and kept away from decisions that shape the future. The hardest missions continue to find him, but they no longer offer a path forward. They are endpoints. By the time Germany surrenders, Patton finds himself surrounded by a victory he does not recognize as his own. The war he understands, defined by motion and pressure, has ended. In its place stands a new order, defined by restraint and political calculation. For a man shaped by crisis, that world feels hostile. Looking back, this phase explains why Patton's career feels truncated rather than concluded. He was not defeated by enemies or rivals. He was overtaken by circumstances. The very conditions that once made him indispensable disappeared, leaving no clear place for him to stand. This is the cost of being trusted only in emergencies. Patton was always called when something had gone wrong. He was sent when timetables broke and confidence faltered. Once those problems disappeared, so did the tolerance for his methods. That is why the hardest missions never turned into lasting authority. They were never meant to. By the time the fighting in Europe reaches its final weeks, the shape of Patton's war is no longer defined by enemy resistance. It is defined by memory. What will be remembered, what will be explained away, and what will quietly be simplified once the guns fall silent. This is the stage where George S. Patton begins to lose control of his own story. During the war itself, Patton's role is understood clearly by the people who rely on him. He is the general sent forward when progress slows, when coordination breaks down, and when delay starts to look dangerous. He is not chosen for balance or diplomacy. He is chosen because pressure needs to be applied immediately, even if that pressure creates problems of its own. Once victory approaches, that logic becomes inconvenient. The emerging Allied narrative begins to emphasize order, planning, and unity. Campaigns are described as deliberate sequences rather than improvised recoveries. Momentum is presented as something carefully managed, not repeatedly rescued. In that version of events, there is little room for a commander whose value lay in fixing situations that were already slipping out of control. Patton's real function does not fit comfortably into peacetime history. History prefers clean arcs. Patton's career is jagged. His hardest missions were never meant to be celebrated. They were meant to prevent embarrassment, panic, and political fallout in moments when the system could not admit vulnerability. Once those moments pass, there is no appetite to preserve their memory. So Patton is reduced. The complexity of his assignments is flattened into speed. The institutional anxiety that led to his use disappears behind stories about temperament and theatrics. His role as a corrective force becomes a personality trait rather than a structural necessity. This shift begins almost immediately after the fighting stops. Patton's successes are acknowledged, but they are framed narrowly. He is praised for aggressiveness, not for timing, for movement, not for context. The fact that his advances often followed stalled operations is quietly omitted. The harder truth, that Allied plans repeatedly required emergency intervention, fades from view. That erasure has consequences. Without context, Patton's behavior looks excessive rather than functional. His impatience appears reckless rather than calculated. His willingness to accept risk seems personal rather than assigned. The system that benefited from his actions quietly steps out of the frame. Patton senses this happening. His frustration in the post-war months is not rooted in a desire for more fighting. It is rooted in a loss of purpose. For years, his value was measured in urgency. He was summoned when failure loomed and dismissed when stability returned. That rhythm shaped his identity. When urgency disappears, so does the framework that made him relevant. The psychological cost of that transition is severe. Patton has lived for years at a level of intensity few commanders experience. He has been judged by speed, by movement, by his ability to force outcomes when others hesitate. Rest never followed success. It only led to the next crisis. That pattern creates a mindset where motion equals meaning. Now, the motion stops. The system that once relied on him begins to prioritize caution, messaging, and restraint. These are not qualities Patton has been rewarded for developing. He finds himself surrounded by administrators and political officers who speak a different language, one that values quiet control over visible action. This disconnect deepens his isolation. Patton's post-war comments, often cited as evidence of poor judgment, cannot be separated from this context. He is speaking from within a worldview shaped by years of crisis management, where clarity comes from hierarchy and pressure, not negotiation. Those instincts did not suddenly appear at the end of the war. They were the same instincts that had made him useful all along. What changed was tolerance. Allied leadership no longer needs a man who thrives on disorder. They need stability, legitimacy, and a clean transition into peace. The qualities that once justified Patton's latitude now justify limiting him. His earlier success does not protect him. It accelerates the desire to move past him. This is why his legacy becomes so uneven. Patton is remembered vividly, but selectively. His name is associated with speed and aggression, while the circumstances that demanded those traits fade into the background. The hardest missions he was given are remembered as triumphs, not as symptoms of systemic strain. That distortion serves a purpose. It allows victory to appear orderly. It protects the reputation of planning institutions. It avoids uncomfortable questions about how often Allied operations required improvisation to stay on track. Patton becomes a character in the story rather than a reflection of its underlying tensions. In that version of history, Patton stands alone. In reality, he never did. He operated within a system that depended on him in moments of weakness and distanced itself once those moments passed. His career is not a story of unchecked ambition. It is a story of repeated intervention, each one harder than the last, each one carrying consequences that outlived the battlefield. This explains why Patton's post-war treatment feels unresolved rather than unjust. He is not punished for failure. He is sidelined because the war no longer needs what he represents. The qualities that once saved campaigns now threaten the calm narrative victory requires. The system does not turn on him. It simply moves forward without him. Looking back, this phase reveals the final cost of being the fix-it general. Patton absorbed pressure so others could preserve order. He acted when plans failed so institutions could remain intact. Once stability returned, his role became uncomfortable to explain and easier to forget. That is how reputations are shaped, not only by what a man does, but by what others need to remember about him. Patton's hardest missions solved immediate problems while creating long-term discomfort. The war demanded his presence. Peace did not. And so his story begins to shrink, not in length, but in depth. What remains is motion without context. What disappears is the reason that motion was ever required in the first place. When the war finally ends, it does not end evenly for everyone. For some commanders, victory brings clarity, recognition, and a defined place in the order that follows. For George S. Patton, it brings something far less comfortable. It brings stillness. And stillness is the one condition his entire wartime role was never designed to survive. For years, Patton existed inside motion. When fronts stalled, he moved. When plans drifted, he pushed. When hesitation threatened to turn into failure, he was sent forward to apply pressure until something broke. That pattern shaped not only his assignments, but his identity. Speed was not a preference. It was proof of relevance. With Germany defeated, that proof no longer mattered. The final weeks of the war stripped Patton of the conditions that once justified his authority. The battlefield no longer demands emergency solutions. The alliance no longer tolerates improvisation that risks political fallout. What remains is administration, occupation, and narrative control, a world governed by restraint rather than urgency. Patton does not fit that world. The same instincts that carried him through crisis now work against him. His directness, once useful when clarity was scarce, now feels disruptive. His emphasis on authority, once effective in chaos, now collides with the need for legitimacy. Nothing about him has changed. The environment has. That is why his post-war marginalization feels abrupt, even though it is not. Patton is not pushed aside because of a single mistake or remark. He is pushed aside because the system no longer requires a man who exists to fix breakdowns. The hardest missions are gone. And without them, the logic that protected him disappears as well. This is where the final misunderstanding of Patton takes hold. History often frames his end as a personal failure or a moral collapse, but the truth is more structural than personal. Patton's role was always conditional. He was empowered during instability and constrained once stability returned. That bargain worked during war. It could not survive peace. The system moves quickly to preserve a version of victory that feels controlled and intentional. Campaigns are remembered as deliberate advances rather than desperate recoveries. Momentum appears steady rather than fragile. In that narrative, there is little room for a general whose greatest value lay in correcting moments when control slipped away. So Patton becomes simplified one last time. He is remembered for speed, for aggression, for personality, while the circumstances that demanded those traits fade quietly into the background. His hardest missions are remembered as triumphs, not as warnings. The pressure he absorbed is forgotten. The risk he carried becomes invisible. That distortion is not accidental. It protects institutions. It reassures the public. It allows victory to feel clean. Acknowledging how often the war required emergency solutions would complicate that story, and Patton's career is evidence of those complications. This is why his legacy feels incomplete. Patton does not belong neatly to the story of orderly triumph. He belongs to the story of near failure, of stalled advances, of moments when confidence wavered, and momentum had to be forced back into existence. He appears where plans stopped working and disappears when they start again. That pattern explains everything about his career. He was never the architect of Allied victory. He was its accelerant. He burned hottest where conditions were worst. He thrived in uncertainty and became unnecessary once certainty returned. The hardest missions always found him because those missions required someone willing to act when hesitation threatened collapse. He accepted those assignments knowing they carried risk, blame, and isolation. He took them anyway, because action was the only currency he trusted. When the war ended, that currency lost its value. What remained was a man shaped by crisis in a world trying to forget how close it came to breaking. The alliance moved on, the narrative settled, and Patton was left standing outside the story he helped make possible. That is the quiet truth behind his legend. George Patton did not fade because he failed. He faded because the war no longer needed what he represented. The hardest missions had passed, and without them, there was no place left for a general built to live inside danger. That is why his name is tied so closely to the war's most difficult moments. And that is why, once those moments ended, history struggled to explain what to do with him at all. If you want to understand the war beyond slogans and simplified legends, make sure you're subscribed. This channel looks at World War II the way it actually unfolded, through decisions made under pressure, compromises that shaped outcomes, and the people used to keep everything from falling apart. If you value deep research, long-form storytelling, and history without shortcuts, subscribe now and stay with us for the next episode. If you want to support this project directly and help keep this kind of long-form history alive, you can do that on Patreon. Your support goes toward research time, source verification, and producing these episodes at the depth they deserve.